When the red phone rang, the world was 13 minutes away from extinction, and I was the one who had to decide. October 16th, 1962, 8:45 a.m. The door to the Oval Office opened in such a way that I knew from my secretary Evelyn Lincoln's face that everything had changed. "Mr. President," she said, her voice trembling, "CIA Director McCone is requesting an emergency briefing." The coffee cup in her hand was shaking slightly. I'd worked with this woman for 33 years. I'd never seen her like this. When John McCone walked in, I was leaning on my cane, trying to suppress that damn pain in my back. As if being a young president wasn't enough, my body had to constantly betray me too. But when McCone spread the photographs on the desk, my back pain suddenly disappeared. It was replaced by a completely different pain: fear. "Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, Mr. President," McCone said. His finger traced over the blurry images captured by the U-2 spy plane. "In the San Cristobal area, SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles. Each one can destroy Washington in 13 minutes. I looked at the photographs. Lines, spots, shadows that would seem meaningless to an ordinary person. But I knew what this was. Nuclear weapons, 90 miles away, within range of Florida, New York, the entire East Coast. I looked out the window. Autumn leaves were falling in the White House garden. Children were coming home from school. People were going to work. None of them knew. This world might be living its final days. "How many?" I asked. My voice was unexpectedly calm. It's strange, in crisis moments, something inside me kicks in, shuts down all my emotions. Maybe this is something I learned in the war. The night my PT-109 torpedo boat was split in two, floating in the dark waters of the Pacific, those who panicked drowned. Those who stayed calm survived. "We don't know exactly yet, sir, but at least 40 missiles, and more could be on the way." McCone paused. "Mr. President, Strategic Air Command is recommending we go to full alert. General LeMay is requesting authorization for an airstrike." Curtis LeMay? Of course he was. For that man, the answer to every problem was bombs. He'd burned Tokyo to ashes in World War II. Now he wanted to obliterate Cuba. But I came from a different path. I'd seen war. I'd seen my friends die at sea. And I knew one thing very well. War was the last resort. "Call XCOM," I said. "Don't leak anything to anyone. If the media finds out, panic starts. And Khrushchev will be forced to move quickly, too." The next hours were a blur. The National Security Council was called to emergency session. My brother Bobby, Defense Secretary McNamara, Secretary of State Rusk, a 15-person team. We called them the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, XCOM. But really, these were 15 men who had to save the world. We sat in the cabinet room. You could feel the weight of the air. The same question on everyone's face. What do we do now? General LeMay stood up. He was a powerful man, cigar smoke rising toward the ceiling. "Mr. President," he said, his voice sharp and commanding, "we have only one option: airstrike. Now. Today. We destroy all the missile sites, then full-scale invasion. We take Cuba in 72 hours. "And what does the Soviet Union do?" I asked. "What happens to our 10,000 American soldiers in Berlin, our NATO allies? Khrushchev won't just sit and watch." "Let him watch or not," LeMay said, shrugging. "If we don't act strong now, we look weak. Weakness invites war." I looked around the table. Some were nodding. General Maxwell Taylor, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy. Those in favor of attack. But I saw hesitation in Bobby's face. Defense Secretary McNamara was lost in thought. "I don't want to create another Pearl Harbor," I said quietly. "America never attacks a small country without warning. That's what makes us different from them." LeMay grimaced. I knew the look in his eyes. Young, inexperienced, weak. He didn't take me seriously. I was 45 years old, the youngest president in the nation's history. A year ago, we'd had a complete fiasco at the Bay of Pigs. Our attempt to invade Cuba ended in humiliating defeat. Now the same generals, the same experts, were telling me to attack again. Other options? I asked. McNamara leaned forward. Naval blockade, he said. We blockade Cuba. We stop Soviet ships. We prevent the missiles from arriving. That's a declaration of war, LeMay said immediately. Stopping Soviet ships in international waters is casus belli for war. No, Bobby said. We call it quarantine, not blockade quarantine. A legal loophole, not aggressive defensive. I slammed my fist on the table. Coffee cups rattled. I need options, not war speeches. Give me 24 hours, I'll think. That night, we didn't turn off the White House lights. My wife Jackie was upstairs with the children, Caroline and John, 5 and 2 years old. In their world, the biggest problem was which toy to play with. In my world, the problem was whether they'd wake up tomorrow morning. Bobby came to my side. My brother, my closest advisor, my conscience. What are you thinking? He asked. I'm thinking, I said, holding my head in both hands, that if I'm wrong, 100 million people die. If I do nothing, the Soviets corner us. If I act too harshly, World War III begins. What would Dad say? Bobby asked quietly. My father, JohnFKennedy, powerful, ruthless, the man who would do anything to win. War, I said with a bitter smile. Dad would say show of force, but Dad lost his son in World War II. Joe Jr. exploded in a plane over Normandy. Dad forgot what war was. The next morning, I made my decision. Naval quarantine. We would blockade Cuba. Soviet ships would be stopped, missiles wouldn't arrive, but we wouldn't attack Cuba. Not yet. October 22nd television address. 18 minutes. The whole world was watching. Studio lights hit my face, my back was throbbing, but I stood straight. The American people saw me on camera, calm, determined. My fellow Americans, I said, Soviet nuclear missiles have been detected in Cuba. These missiles can target the entire East Coast, including Washington. The United States has placed Cuba under quarantine. I have a clear message for the Soviet Union. These missiles must go. When the speech ended, silence. Then the phones started ringing. Panic. Stampedes in supermarkets to stock food. Shelter sales exploded. Some families left the city. But the most terrifying thing was this. The Pentagon had gone to DEFCON 2, nuclear war preparation, for the first time in history. October 24th. Soviet ships were approaching the quarantine line. CIA reports were coming in. 20 ships heading toward Cuba. Were there missiles inside? We didn't know. But if the ships tried to break the quarantine, the U.S. Navy would open fire. And then, Dean Rusk whispered beside me, we're eyeball to eyeball. We waited in the Situation Room. The clock was ticking. 10:25. Soviet ships were 10 miles from the line. 10:30. 5 miles. 10:32. Mr. President! The CIA liaison officer ran into the room. The Soviet ships! They've stopped! They're turning back! For a moment, all the air emptied from the room. Then everyone breathed at the same time. Rusk smiled beside me. They blinked. But this wasn't over, because the missiles in Cuba were still there, and Khrushchev sent a message. We'll withdraw the missiles, but remove your Jupiter missiles in Turkey. LeMay went crazy. Never! That's a sign of weakness. But I knew. The missiles in Turkey were already obsolete, useless. We had submarine missiles. But if we openly admitted this, we'd look weak to the Soviets. The world leadership war was a war of perceptions. I gave Bobby a secret mission. He would meet with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. Secretly. Withdraw the missiles, he would say, and we'll remove the Turkey missiles. But let's do it secretly. 6 months from now, quietly. It can't look like a trade to the public. October 27th. Black Saturday. Our U-2 plane flying over Cuba was shot down. Pilot Major Rudolph Anderson was killed. The Pentagon wanted war. "Time for retaliation!" LeMay was shouting. "No," I said. My voice was cold. "I'm not destroying the world over one plane. We'll wait. We're waiting for Khrushchev's response." I didn't sleep that night. I walked in the White House garden. I looked at the sky. The stars were shining. I thought, maybe tomorrow no one will be left to see these stars. Maybe humanity ends here. But on the morning of October 28th, a miracle happened. Radio broadcast, Moscow. Khrushchev's voice. "The Soviet Union has decided to withdraw the missiles from Cuba." It was over. 13 days. 13 days of hell. And the world was still turning. I looked at XCOM. Tired faces, wrinkled suits, but living faces. "Gentlemen," I said, "history may not remember us. Maybe no one will know these 13 days, but we know. We saved the world." The next week, Caroline was playing in the garden. When she saw me, she ran. "Daddy," she said, "where were you? I missed you." I picked her up. My back hurt, but I didn't care. "Daddy was at work," I said. "But I'm here now, and I'll always be here for you." She didn't understand, of course. She was 5 years old. But one day she would understand. One day, history books would write about these 13 days. And maybe people would understand. Leadership isn't about dropping bombs. Leadership is having the courage not to drop them. That night I lay in my bed. Jackie was beside me. "Everyone thought you were weak," she said quietly. "But you were the strongest, because you knew how to say no." I closed my eyes. For the first time in 13 days, I truly slept. But in my dreams, I still saw them. The red phone, the CIA photographs, the Soviet ships, and I thought, never again. The world must never come this close again. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't the last crisis. Humanity would always walk at the edge of the abyss. The only hope was that among leaders there would be reason, patience, and most importantly, courage. Starting a war is easy. Preserving peace, that's true courage. And I, in those 13 days, made my history. I didn't launch missiles. I saved lives.